Right. Good. So let's start up. Why don't you start by giving us like a 2 to 5 minute introduction to you, and then we'll get into the materials. How you got interested in the issue, what you're doing now, things like that.
All right, great. So I will give you a quick introduction. I'm sitting here in the rotunda of the Russell Senate offices. So I've been meeting with staffers. Right down the hall, you have the office of Mitch McConnell. You might have heard of him. Mark Rubio's upstairs. John McCain's office with the door closed right now, which is a little bit sad. So for the last 5 years, I've been looking at congressional transparency issues. And as you probably started to gather from talking with Mark and in the readings, most people don't think it's an issue at all. So we've interviewed people here, just randoms on the street, and we're like, hey, what do you feel about transparency in government or congressional transparency? And they're like, aren't you going to ask a question? Because that's just so obvious. You should have as much as possible all the time. And what we're finding through our research is that that's just absolutely not true. So as you might know, the founding fathers closed all discussion during the writing of the Constitution, and Alexander Hamilton said that they were closed because if you opened it, special interests would win. So special interests would destroy the process and they'd control the process. James Madison said that if you open the process, it would become partisan. So everyone in the committees, if it was open to the public, would hardline. So they would have to stick to the issue that they were talking about 5 years ago in the exact same way. Otherwise, people will go, oh, he's changing his mind. He doesn't really know what he's saying. And so you walk into every session that's open and you have to hold to positions that you've already held. So for nearly 200 years, 1789 until 1970, all committees of importance in the United States were closed. All important markup sessions, and markup sessions are where they actually write and change bills, were closed. And so John F. Kennedy, when he worked in markup sessions as a senator, all his votes, all his actions in committee were secret. So 98 to 99% of his votes in Congress were secret. And then they'd have the floor votes where they'd all walk out to the floor, they'd put their suit on, they'd shave, they'd shower, and then they'd have these votes that were more public. And they would say, hey, nay, and they'd do all their things and people would record it. If you saw the Lincoln movie, the entire movie is about a floor vote, which was one of the few votes that was public. All other votes were secret. They opened this up in 1970, and it was under no public pressure. In fact, the words transparency and accountability weren't used at the time to talk about government issues. We find no record of that. And even when Princeton scholar Douglas Arnold is writing about transparency issues in 1990, there's no reference to accountability or transparency in his book. He uses words like traceability and watching what members do, but holding members accountable and transparency are just not words that are associated with government. And so they opened votes in 1970, and we know exactly what happens. It isn't the public that floods in. The public wasn't following votes or Congress beforehand, but it's the special interests that flood in. And this gives enormous power to outside groups. And as we claim in our work, all accountability benefits those in power. And we've yet to see an example where this isn't true. And so you've got big pharma, will watch all the pharmaceutical votes or healthcare votes or even votes on spending. The NRA famously will follow all the votes based on gun legislation. And what happens if your vote is transparent and you make a vote that's not in line with one of these special interests? They don't even tell you. They don't even make this threat. You know the threat is there because everyone's seen these actions now for 50 years. If you make a vote against any of these special interests, they will pour money into your district back at home. So even though you're working in DC, they will go to your district in Florida or your district in Alaska, and they will pour money into it to try and take you out in the next election. So they will pour money into your opponent. They will pour money into negative ads. Okay, so they will do everything to take you out. And so a lot of people are like, well, these members of Congress, they're taking all this money. Most of the money is dark money, and 95% of dark money goes into advertising. And 90% of that is probably negative. So I'm speaking with the people at Open Secrets, they pretty much confirm these numbers. And then if you're going to do campaign finance, I actually donated money to Hillary. Not the world's biggest fan of Hillary, but I was terrified of Donald Trump. It was the first time I donated money to anyone. And it was the first time because it was the first time I was completely terrified by a candidate. So even though Hillary got my money, I was not asking Hillary to do anything different. I was just saying, make sure you aren't him. All right, and so a lot of the money that even goes to individual candidates isn't given to them to change their positions. It's actually given to them to not be this other person. And so when people talk about bribery and campaign finance, yes, there is a transparency issue there, right? No one's going to give you money for a vote that they can't see. So if you're familiar with the secret ballot was introduced in 1890. Right at the height of the Gilded Age. Okay, in the Gilded Age, votes were being bought left and right by groups like Tammany Hall, and they threw the election from New York. Mark's familiar with New York. And they threw the presidential election from New York. They were spending up to $25 per vote. With the secret ballot, they stopped spending on votes because you give someone $25, they walk behind the curtain, and they vote the way they please. And so money in government actually dropped enormously after the introduction of the secret ballot. Campaign finance basically dropped enormously because that was campaign finance at the time. And it had all been really low, and partisanship had been really low until they opened up the doors of Congress in 1970. So that's probably a pretty good, couple-minute introduction. Probably we can talk more into some of the details.
Okay, so I know some students had some questions or comments on the reading, so I will let them go. James, did you want to lead it off?
Sure. Hey, how you doing? In reading your articles and your website, you seem to posit that money in politics and transparency can't exactly operate at the same time. They can't coexist. So if we're going to we're going to regulate either money in politics or transparency in a way that removes rights from citizens, why are we focusing on transparency, and why not focus on changing how money in politics works rather than removing transparency from a broader general public?
It's a great question. If our focus was only on campaign finance, so a lot of the examples I gave you were to let you know that campaign finance actually is not the biggest problem we see. We actually think that the biggest problem is intimidation. And so you can be intimidated in many ways, right? We don't believe that members are changing their votes because you're giving them money. We believe that members are changing their votes because you're scaring them. And sure, you could regulate negative advertisement. You could regulate the amount of money you give to a candidate. But you mentioned something very important there. You say, well, transparency is a right to citizens. Well, there's nothing in the Constitution, first of all, that says that, so it's not a given right that we understand. Interestingly, if you look at Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution, there is the opposite right. So there is a right to secrecy. So Article 1 of Section 5 says the legislature should have a right to secrecy, and at times can call for the yeas and nays. In the Constitution, the yeas and nays are referring not to, I raise my hand, attach my name to my vote. It was just the final outcome. So the yeas and nays would mean 220 to 172. That would be the yeas and nays, and that's a secret vote. You're giving the final vote count. Now, You mentioned that this right that you have, and so citizens really want this right. We don't have any evidence that citizens want this right or use this right. So I work with David King. He's a Harvard professor of Congress. I talk to legislators. I talk to people who are very invested in Congress. It is a rare scholar, academic, or Washington insider who follows more than 15 to 20 votes a year. Your legislator is making thousands votes a year, thousands. So I'd be shocked if there's anybody in the room there that will say they're following more than 30 votes a year. And that would be, you'd be in the 1%, you'd be in the 0.01%. But we know who's following those votes. So we wouldn't be closing down something that the citizens are taking advantage of. There was never any history, there's never been any study that suggests that citizens follow these votes. We get just the opposite. Most citizens don't know their members' names. Most citizens don't know if they're a Republican or Democrat. There's a lot of citizens who don't know if the president is a Republican or Democrat. And so we're providing this information, none of which most citizens, even scholarly citizens, can understand, because you have the, for example, you have the Commerce Committee, which since 1950 has generated over 1 million pages of hearings. So to understand the votes, you would need to read, just for the Commerce Committee, and remember there's 20 standing committees in the House and there's more standing committees in the Senate, you would need to read 1 million pages of hearings. The other day at 10 o'clock, there were 5 or 6 hearings in the Senate alone. Some members were responsible for being at 3 of them. They started all at 10. They generate 1,000 pages each of people talking and referencing and submitting stuff and passing documents. It's impossible. And I'm not the only person to say this. Amitai Etzioni, I believe he's at Columbia or something like that, says it's impossible for citizens to follow this legislation. And remember that what a lobbyist, so Jack Abramoff, said, when we submit the things we want to change that help us, the corrupt legislation that we want, we write it so no one on earth can understand it. So you can go back and read the lines that Jack Abramoff had inserted into a law, but if you can understand them, you're better than most people. So you're right, that's exactly what people feel. We're removing a right to transparency, but we're trying to weigh the benefits and costs and trying to make the best possible system. And remember, the Founding Fathers said just the opposite. It wasn't a right to transparency they were protecting. It was a right to secrecy.
No, go ahead. Right. In the spirit of transparency.
In the spirit of transparency, where does your organization get its funding?
Where do we get our funding? From our pockets. We are not funded at all. So we all dedicate our time. We pay for our own travel. We do all our own research. So we haven't made a penny from anybody outside of the members that you see on the page. So we don't declare any funding because we don't have any funding.
Sorry, that's really impressive. As a corollary, I mean, what got you interested in this personally? And why did you decide to?
Right. So my son was born in 2011. He was born kind of as an accident, so he came out of nowhere. And I have always been terrified. Personally, I'm very attached to the idea of climate change. And now I've brought this kid in this world, and to me, the world is marching in this crazy direction, and he's going to be feeling these costs much greater than I will. And so I actually started to get very curious into trying to solve climate change. So I actually won a contest at MIT for a market-based approach. So I was using cryptocurrencies, and it was using reputation systems, and so I won this big contest. But right at the same time, I was also looking at these congressional issues, and everything that I was reading to do with government, and I didn't care which side you read. So if you're on the right and you were writing about government, you would say, well, sometime in the 1970s, spending started to go through the roof, and we couldn't close down any programs. If you're on the left, you're saying, well, inequality is rising like crazy. Incarceration rates are rising like crazy. And I just kept looking at things, and I brought in data. And if you bring in the congressional voting data, the one thing that's the most clear is you get this big elbow right at 1970. Like, okay, what's this odd elbow? And I started researching about it, and no one had written about that elbow. Well, now I know that some people have, but like chapter 7, page 192 of their book, they mention that there was a change in the way that members voted. And this change, this elbow rises at the same pace and at the same angle as inequality and spending and healthcare costs. And you see other things that go flat at that time, like male wages, etc. And so when you have a juicy correlation like that, obviously you have to inspect it, and you certainly have to consider it as a possible factor. I believe we have more than just a possible factor. I don't know if you saw our list of citations. We've now got 350 academic citations, members of Congress, people in industry, scholars from major universities, all saying that this is a problem. And I would say they're all saying it in sort of the same way the founding fathers said it. So they were very scared to talk about this idea. So Hamilton, when he wrote about the idea of closed sessions, he wrote using a pseudonym. He wrote in the Federalist Papers using amicus. When Madison talked about this, he spoke about it 1 year before he died in 1830, not in 1789. When George Washington acted on this, he never spoke about it publicly, but there's very strong evidence that he was going after people for breaking the secrecy rule that they had. So they were very scared to talk about this idea. And as you can imagine, it would be very tough if you're a legislator right now. We speak to legislators a lot. Legislators will talk to you like this. They'll go, oh my God, if this was secret, we could do this. We could pass environmental legislation. We could work on gun control. They whisper this to you, because what legislator can raise their hands and say, well, I think all my votes should be secret. It's better for you, right? The people will go crazy. And so legislators are actually often terrified of the people on certain issues, and this is one of them. I'd say there's probably 3 or 4 other ones that the people are blatantly wrong about in terms of the evidence. And so incarceration, criminal justice is another big problem like that, where the perception of crime is 20 to 40% higher than what the reality is on crime. And so because the legislators' votes are transparent, they're actually afraid to vote on lowering arrests or being soft on crime. So they're terrified of that. Instead, they actually have to vote, because the people have the misinterpretation of it. They have to vote on tougher laws. And so incarceration rates go through the roof when they open this thing up. We've now got over 2 million people in jail. We're the highest at any point in history. We're the highest of any developed country. In 1970, the incarceration rates have been dropping for 40 years, and they were talking about eliminating jails in the US. So think about that. Think about what that might mean, right? And people will say crack and all this. The evidence just isn't there. It's a policy issue.
James, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so you touched on a little bit exactly the next question I wanted to ask about, which is, how do you get past the public relations problem with saying that less transparency is better? Because, after I read your website, I have talked to several of my friends about, that I think you might have a good idea. And as soon as you say close the votes, people literally recoil and like, why would never? And so how do you get past that public relations issue? And second to that, what could you say to convince a representative or convince a public figure that embracing less transparency would be better? How could you convince them to convey that in a way that doesn't look shady? I mean, like you brought it up a little bit, that anytime they say that, people immediately begin to assume, oh, that's because you want to take some bribes in the back corner. So 2 questions, how do you get past the PR problem, and then how do you convince a representative to embrace that without losing their job?
I mean, that question is what I struggle with every day. The answer is I absolutely don't know. I do find, however, that the people who get it the quickest are people who work in government. So if I speak with someone who's a legislator or a representative or has worked as a staffer, that conversation in 2 minutes, I'm there with them. If I speak to someone, you've got these groups like Represent.us, you've got the Sunlight Foundation. You know, oddly, these groups are usually formed by people who had a graduate degree in painting or a graduate degree in poetry, right? And so these are people who don't work in legislation. They don't see what it's really like. They don't see how the sausage gets made. Did you hear that Hamilton song? They have that song about in the room where it happened, right? And they talk about agreeing when they close the doors, which is very interesting. But getting back to your point, legislators get it, but they're in a bad position to talk about it. And so I spoke with a staffer yesterday, and he says, off the record, we are 100% on board with this. This is the legislative director for a senator in the US, right? And I've heard this now many times. So it's really important that we reach out to the public and we try and get professors. You know, Mark has been great. Mark's one of the few that's mentioned that it's almost impossible for a citizen to keep up with legislation. I think that's one of the points that I really gravitated to his work on. And just get the idea out there. If I speak to someone nowadays, usually within 20 minutes, I've got them at least leaning in the other direction or thinking about it. So it's a PR campaign. We are about to publish a big article with a big magazine, so we're talking with the editors at Foreign Affairs, who are really big fans of this. So for us, that would be huge because you might have noticed we haven't been able to publish anything. So the article you read by Brent has been rejected everywhere. So we've been rejected by like 20 different places. I think it's a great article, but you've got to just overcome the bias of the people who are reading the abstract and going, oh, these lunatics, right? They're now going to try and convince me of this retarded thing. And a lot of times, so we submitted to Perspectives Journal, which is in Florida, which the main guys now are based out of Florida. But on the board are 20 people from different universities all over the country. 3 of them have articles talking about the benefits of transparency based on no data, right? It's just this belief that transparency is good. So yeah, we got rejected. So yeah, it's a tough problem. That's what we're working on all the time. We were just at the APSA handing out flyers like crazy, and I'm here talking with people for the first time. This is my first sort of rounds in the Capitol, and it's been going pretty well. I actually meet with AEI today, which is Republican think tank, one of the strongest ones. And what's great is I'm pretty left, or traditionally have been pretty left, but the right embraces this with the same energy. I mean, they're very excited. I just spoke in University of New Orleans, invited by 2 big Republican professors there who are very energetic about this, because everybody hates lobbying. Everybody hates being intimidated. Everybody hates that the government is spinning out of, we spend too much, we can't shut down programs, we can't build things that we want to build. This is evidence of what you can build when the voting is secret.
Is that good or bad? After all, wasn't Senator Russell a bad guy? Haven't we just learned that Senator Russell's a bad guy? That's beyond my knowledge base there, Mark. I'll let you talk about that. Well, so I will kick in for a second. I just gave a semi-vigorous and mostly serious defensive lobby. That lobbying is not nearly so bad as in the same way that transparency is not nearly so good as it's assumed. Lobbying is not nearly so bad. Now, there might be problems with the lobbying game, but lobbyists are not so bad in and of itself, and not only because they're lawyers and they make a lot of money, and so we like them. It's only for that reason. But because they're not so bad. So, what do you say to the idea that lobbying is not so bad, and that the idea that the lobbyists are the bad guys here? But for the lobbyists, our virtuous representatives would be able to do their jobs much better. I am a 100% fan of everything you just said. I believe the right to petition the government, which is there in the First Amendment, should be sacrosanct. It should be held. I actually have no problems with Citizens United.
All right, I don't have any problems with spending money. All right, so I have no problems if every lobbyist in the world was to take every member of Congress to every party and give them as much money as they want, as long as the vote is secret. And we find funny things happen. You get a lot less money when that vote is secret. But also remember, so what the game they're playing, there's only one difference. And this is what I would do. If I was a lobbyist these days, I would play the exact same game the NRA does, and the NRA basically writes the playbook for how to be a powerful lobbyist, is you do all the important things. You talk to scholars, you talk to academics, you try and get articles and papers, you talk to legislators. That's great. Please do all of that. The only difference is, can you say or else? So vote this way or else. It's the or else I have the problem with, right? And or else is a measure of the amount of power that you can throw around. All right, so I'm all in favor of you go lobbying your issue, be it everyone should eat toenails, and pressuring people as much as you can. But if you can say or else, vote this way or else, that's a problem. And that will only benefit those with money. And it has nothing to do with the logic of your argument or how persistent and passionate you are about your idea. So I'm all in favor of lobbying. I'm all in favor of the passion. They should just remove that one little hook.
Questions?
What is your name, by the way?
Lee.
Wade. Hey, Wade.
Just as a follow-up to some things we've already talked about, I mean, and you touched on this a little bit, but if we have a secret process, what stops the representatives from just voting to enrich themselves and their friends and us not being able to do anything about it?
Well, the same problem that you might run into as an outside lobbyist, you're going to run into in Congress, which is when and legislators, by the way, are some of the biggest lobbyists today. So the president becomes an important lobbyist when the process is open. But even the Speaker of the House, I talk endlessly about the amount of powers given to the Speaker by opening up the process, right? If you open up the committee, the Speaker can now look in, and the Speaker has a lot of powers to be able to screw legislators to the wall. Now, say for example, you're just an individual legislator and you just want to build a shipyard for your buddy, all right? And you want to do that as corrupt as possible. Well, it turns out that corruption is much easier if the process is transparent. If all of the members are voting secretly, well, what are you going to do for them that's going to make them vote for it, right? You're going to say, hey, I'll give you money. And they're going to be like, yeah, I'll take the money. And then they're going to vote the way they please if they're voting secretly, right? So deals with secret voting can't, the whole prisoner's dilemma is based off the idea that you separate the two individuals from being able to see the actions of the other person, and then all groups and all deals break down, right? So deals that were held previously. If it's transparent, you look over at your buddy, you're like, hey, you told me you were going to vote that way. Now I'm not going to vote for anything of yours. And we get, that's called log rolling, right? You can trade votes if you can follow votes. You can't trade votes if you can't follow them. So the big horse of the Legislative Reorganization Act, which was Tip O'Neill, he pushed this legislation through and became the Speaker, and he started to screw members to the wall for how they voted, right? And he basically built Tufts University out of power, right? Tufts came from his district. Tufts was a tiny commuter school. They didn't have a medical building in downtown Boston. They didn't have all the crazy funding they now get. And he personally built that without putting a penny of his money in. And he was doing that by trading votes, right? But he was screwing people to the wall. So you might notice that the Koch brothers are really good at this. They walk out of their garage in the morning and they say, hey, we'll give $1 million to anyone who votes against the Obama's health care. Or we'll give $1 million to anyone who supports the new revised version. Well, that deal is worth nothing if they can't see the actual votes. So everyone says that secrecy equals corruption. I don't know if that's so true. True secrecy, it's really hard to hold a corrupt bargain. Even if you're a gangster, right, you have to see the dead body on television to pay the hitman off, right? You have to have some verification that this person was killed and put in the river. But if you don't know that, there's no deal. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that gives you some idea of how protective secrecy is at preventing corruption, instead of the cliche we always hear, which is the opposite. Oh, backroom deals, backroom deals. Cut a deal in the back room. It's not so easy. It's much easier publicly.
There. I understand the results-based argument in terms of, you know, if we have secrecy and people can vote the way that they, you know, want to vote or think they should vote, then perhaps they will. How much do you think that comes down to an underlying problem of trust? Like, if there's not a sufficient level of trust in congressional representatives or government representatives in any capacity, you know, that I guess I see that as this sort of like source of demand for transparency. Like, yes, there is this manipulative capacity where, you know, you can say you're going to do this or else, but there's also, I think that people want to see what's happening because they don't trust the right thing will happen. So even if, you know, what they're seeing, like there is more corruption because of that, I guess, how do you convince people to trust enough that they don't have to see everything that's happening, even if they know that the results are going to be better when they can't see it?
I don't know the answer to your question. Obviously, that's going to be a tough issue. People are obsessed with secrecy. So, you know, you have these whistleblowers all the time. Chelsea Manning, what's the name of the other famous guy hid out in Russia? Snowden, right? And what was amazing is they made enormous amounts of press about these people, and even Hillary Clinton's emails, right? These secret things we're so obsessed with it, but almost no one can tell you what they actually revealed. And what they revealed in many cases didn't change anything about anything, right? There's some famous examples where the revelation, you've got the Vietnam stuff, the Pentagon Papers, where the revelation was important. But in most cases, we're more obsessed with the story of the secrecy and who Chelsea Manning was and Eric Snowden, right? It just shows our obsession with like peeking through the window of our neighbor, right? We're so obsessed with anything that we can't be a part of, that we're literally only interested in it if it was secret. And in fact, there's some games, I think Mark maybe even spoke about this. Someone spoke about this in Berlin, where you actually make something appear secret if you want it to get attention, right? If you want your legislation to get attention, it will get no attention if you just walk out into the town hall and just, if I blab right here and I'm like, oh, here's my new legislation, no one will show up. But if I look like I'm hiding, everyone's going to show up and learn about what I'm doing. So that's one issue. The other is, and it's really interesting, is that we actually set up this model whereby we show that a ideal, perfect legislator who will not take a bribe, who will not subject themselves to any intimidation, will, because of transparency, be forced into appearing corrupt. And I can explain it somewhat quickly, and it might make sense. I've not got it down to the really short version, but I'm going to give it a try. Which is, say my number one issue is I want more running shoes in schools, right? That's my number one issue. I run on that, and all my voters jump on board on that, all right? And I win the election by 1%, the tiniest of margins, 0.1%. And so my opponent has 49%. So I'm right on the edge of being knocked out in the next election. So I have to be really careful how I vote on everything else. If I've spent my whole life trying to get more running shoes, how am I going to vote now on the gun legislation? Well, if I vote in a way that annoys 2% or 5% of the population, and they're going to come out and vote against me in the next election, I'm going to lose my ability to do the running shoes thing. And so I might be forced, in order to do this thing I've always dreamed of, to avoid pissing off a certain constituency on something that's not a number one issue for me. And so I go, okay, well, I'll do the gun legislation because this other thing's so important. And of course we're saying running shoes, but what if it's child hunger, or what if it's disease prevention, or what if it's something that really does compare in terms of lives lost? And that dynamic takes place with every special interest group. So if you're 1% away from winning election, you're vulnerable from any special interest group. And if you don't vote with them and support them, you're going to lose the election, and all the issues you've worked your life on, you're going to get taken out. And not only will you get taken out, usually your opponent is holding the opposite views. And so they're going to say, no more running shoes, we want everyone to have hiking boots, right? And you're going to be, oh, devastated, right? And so your whole life you'll feel terrible that you didn't vote to support the NRA. So it's weird that so what transparency does is it forces you to give up votes to be passionate and ideal. So that's an ideal legislator, right? Think about that. That's an ideal one. And that's it. We kind of look at it that way. The members I talk to on both sides of the aisle, I would say in many cases, are idealistic. That's the thing they're holding to. So I speak to Republican legislators a lot, I speak to Democratic ones, and I find a lot of good people. I'm not finding all these assholes that everyone's talking about. I'm finding, a lot of people are in compromised positions because of transparency.
Thank you. Bye.
So, James, how in your perfect system would we know who to vote for? So you are right that the problem would be from the lobbyist perspective that we can't verify and therefore can't close the transaction with the legislator. But doesn't that end up being the same problem then for voters? And is your problem with transparency, or is it with democracy?
Well, I love democracy, and actually love representative democracy, and I actually think we had a really good one in 1970. Now, my perfect system, if I was just to play God right now, I would look at the number of votes that people do follow. And statistically, we know that the people will follow anywhere between 1 and 20. And so I would look for a system that was bringing members out for maybe that number of votes. But we don't have to look too far, because in 1970, the floor votes, which weren't the committee votes, were around 200. So I'm okay with the floor votes. That's how people elected Kennedy to office. That's how they elected Goldwater, and they're big fans of them. They were judging them on their positions. These people walk out of committees and make public statements on their issues all the time. We see their past. Most people are voting on personality and your past life. Trump never had a vote in committee in his life before he was elected president, but we felt very enthusiastic about voting for him. What we find is strangely the opposite. You're now, because you've got a long voting record, more likely to lose, because you've now had to make a stand. As I was talking with the woman just a second ago, you're forced to take a stand on issues that you don't fully agree in. So you actually look dirty. And so it's very hard for veterans now to run for office. And there's a lot of literature on that, right? The more votes you've taken, the more at risk you are to winning office. So Obama was an outsider, Clinton was an outsider, Carter was an outsider. So the Democrats are electing these massive outsiders. And even on the right, Reagan was an outsider, Bush Sr. was an outsider, and so was, well, a little less, but Bush Jr. had come as a governorship, right? So you're talking a lot of outsiders, where these outsiders will attack the incumbents for their votes. And so we've got 200 floor votes a year. I'm comfortable with leaving them open, even though we found massive corruption on some of them, like Medicaid Part D in 2003 and others. I'm comfortable with leaving that open, as there's enough ability for members to hide in committee. So my perfect scenario would be providing just enough so that citizens get everything they want. And historically, we know they want very, very little. We were working pretty good in 1970. Inequality had been dropping for 50 years. That's a great number. We passed strong environmental legislation, strong civil rights legislation. Was the world perfect? No. No one in 1970 would have said the world was going great. but we're better off in many paths than we are now. And I don't care if you're on the right or the left, the numbers are screaming that. So,
final questions? Well, thank you, James.